who's our Executive Vice President and Business Development and Delivery. Next, we would love to know if you're considering AVS support migrations to Azure Cloud Services. So if you could, please put your anonymous answer in the poll when it comes up. Again, this is anonymous, so please don't be shy. If you have questions today, please put them in the chat, raise your hand, or you can always email us at youalreadyownit@go-planet.com. For more information about today's program and some of our past blogs and Cloud Office Hours recordings, be sure to check them out on the links in the newsletter that was sent earlier this week. If you're not getting the newsletter, please reach out to YouAlreadyOwnIt@go-planet.com to get onboarded to the program and added to the email list. Also, be sure to check out the useful links in the deck at the end of the presentation. And yes, the link to the presentation and a recording will go out in a follow-up email, so feel free to share it with others and your colleagues. With that said, just a quick warning, we started recording and we're going to go ahead and get started. So with me today, today we're going to be discussing navigating VMware pricing increases, Azure solutions for cost optimization. For those new to AVS, just think of it as an extension of your local on-prem VMware environment that can now be deployed in Azure. Today, we'll talk about some of the new updated information since we last discussed this back in November 2023, and discuss the benefits of why you might want to consider moving to AVS. So with me today is Jason Griffith. Jason's our Director of Cloud Computing here at Planet. Jason, we're so glad you're here joining us today on the program today. Thanks. And we have a full agenda, so let's go ahead and get started. Jason, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Ken. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time this afternoon to join us on this presentation. So from an agenda perspective, we're going to talk about some of the current challenges organizations are facing, not only just with the announcements and impacts of the price change from Broadcom, but also, if you're looking to, leverage other capabilities in Azure, what are the options that you have? So we're going to walk through the challenges. We're going to talk about the options in Azure. We're going to provide, some architecture examples about what AVS and Azure look like, and as well as how does it interact with the other Azure native services. We'll discuss and highlight some migration strategies and options, and what does a move mean? And also, what are the costs from an Azure perspective if you're going to leverage AVS as that option? And then we also have a special offer that we'll just talk about that's available if this is something that you'd like to continue talking about. So with that, it really comes down to why is this an important topic now? And really, it's being driven because Broadcom, a while ago, and the customers that we've spoken to are seeing significant price increases and reduction of SKUs that Broadcom is now offering and impacting how customers are paying for their on-premise and VMware environments. So they're starting to really invest that time to look at alternatives to their virtualization solutions. And really what we want to share today is understanding what those options are, from leveraging VMware in Azure, which is also called AVS, or even considering Azure native infrastructure as services or platform services to run and manage your applications. And so really where it comes down to is if I want to continue with the investments that I've made from a skills perspective and capabilities within VMware, do I continue leveraging that, but maybe hosted in Azure? What does that change look like? What are the impacts to my business and my stakeholders? Is there a potential ROI on that change or considering that technology replacement? Or, do I look at leveraging Azure native capabilities from an infrastructure or from a platform service as well? So those options are all on the table, and we're going to kind of walk through those different ones today. So, we highlighted a little bit, but what are your options from leveraging Azure as a virtualization replacement? So you can leverage Azure VMware. So it's native VMware that's built in Azure. You can leverage your existing licenses as part of this, and there's some credits and some options that Microsoft provides to be able, if you've already invested in a renewal, or if your renewal is due in some time, you can actually leverage the full AVS stack, and your VMware licenses are included in the Azure monthly cost. Also, Azure is, or AVS is also available in the commercial and just recently the government tenant as well. So that's a really key benefit for organizations who have compliance or Azure government tenants today. You could also look at transitioning out of VMware completely and leverage Azure infrastructure native capabilities with VMs, Windows, Linux OS, and you have a variety of VM sizing options that you can meet that you may be using today. And then you could also leverage platform services to completely get rid of compute options and potentially move databases, your existing applications into containers or Kubernetes, as well as analytic options as well. So it's not a one size fit all that situation most customers are looking at. You do have a unique set of options when you look to leverage cloud capabilities. When you start to look at those Azure foundations and you start to think through that decision tree, Azure provides that long range of cloud computing options, and choosing the one really wants to address what skills you have from an IT team, what technologies you've invested in to make sure you maintain and leverage those environments, and then also what does your future look like. So you want to be able to think through how are you best going to leverage the services that you have today for your stakeholders, and which option would best meet those services, not only from a cost, but from a service delivery experience that your stakeholders may need. So, why do we need VMware in Azure? And so with this, you really have the ability to extend your existing VMware to Azure and give you a direct advantage, such as leveraging your existing knowledge. AVS is the exact same product as you will find on-prem, and the look and feel are the same as your operators are used to. The main features are all there, and there's no threshold or learning curve for your IT team to start using AVS once deployed into Azure. So, so what are some of those options and the common use cases that we see in this? So there are some organizations that will look to leverage AVS for high availability, cloud bursting, and disaster recovery. Maybe they don't want to reinvest in a new set of VMware hardware. They're content with what they have, and now they're going to start to leverage new workloads into AVS. You also have the ability from an IT expansion, a data center reduction, or even retirement to be able to get out of your data center and to just use AVS in the cloud only and have that shift occur. You can also leverage different options from a desktop virtualization. So most customers that we've seen leverage Citrix or Horizon, you can still leverage those capabilities in AVS as well, or as part of your your technology change, you could look to switch over to Azure Virtual Desktop, and again to leverage the amount of different licenses from a procurement perspective that you're looking for. You could also, from a speed and simplification for mergers and acquisitions, if you buy a new organization and they're leveraging VMware, how do you intake that environment to be able to support and migrate those instances to AVS as well? Running VMware natively on Azure, it's a completely managed VMware implementation that's built in the Azure data center. And so when you start to look at that migration approach, so what's the initial decisions that you have to start thinking through? So your expected connectivity between on-prem and AVS running in Azure, most times based on latency and the data speeds that you'll need, customers are going to want to consider a higher bandwidth option such as ExpressRoute. That's especially going to be required if you need to coexist for a longer period. Azure VPN can work depending on the speed of application integrations that you may require, or it could also be as a stepping stone deployment to get everything quickly into Azure and then refactor towards Azure native solutions. So again, as you start thinking about what your continued use or potential exit strategy, helps to define your approach to what the connectivity options that you want to have between your on-premise data center and the Azure environment itself. Now, always one thing to consider from an express route, and starting to use AVS, it's the time to establish the express route as well. That does take time, as that's kind of out of the hands of Microsoft and others, but it's a key factor as you start to consider your AVS migration and your planning approach is what is that connectivity? What is that speed? How long will you continue to use it? And you want to make that as a key cornerstone of your project deployment and project plan. Within Azure today, AVS nodes are really they're physical servers in the cloud environment. We order those dedicated hardware nodes from Microsoft when you the chosen region that you want to use, and you'll be able to create the VMware software defined data center components. Ordering a new node in Azure is pretty quick and takes less than 24 hours. And then once you have that available, you can start deploying AVS and start the network and identity authentication integration. So you can create the hybrid relationship between the on-premise VMware environment and the AVS environment. Now, one thing to note that as part of this, there is a minimum requirement that AVS requires 3 nodes to form the AVS cluster to start. So that's really critical. As in with most customers, they will start with an AV36, and then depending on growth, depending on the size of their existing environment, you may potentially upgrade to an AV52 or a higher cluster. But again, that really depends on where you're at today. You can always add more nodes to the current, but it depends on what your threshold is going to be if you need to start looking at the heavier SKUs. Today, if you are leveraging Azure Government, the 36 is the one that's only available in Azure Gov today. But in the commercial deployments, all of the options are available. So, Azure VMware in government, it's generally available now. There's new certifications that are going to be coming, but you can deploy it as the service from the Azure Government Portal. It's available only today in the US Gov Virginia and the Arizona region. So for those that are familiar with Azure Gov, there's really 3 regions. Texas is not included, so the service is not available in the Texas region, but Microsoft, has that on the roadmap to get included, but it's available in Gov and Arizona regions today. You can buy it on an hourly on-demand pricing, or you can choose a 1-year and 3-year reserved pricing instance that could potentially save up to 50% on that monthly cost. Microsoft did just recently receive their FedRAMP High PATO certification, and then higher level certifications are following shortly as well based on the JAB review timelines. So, you can optimize your licensing costs from a predictable pricing perspective. So, licensing is always complicated. And the key takeaways to really to understand from this is, you can reuse reserved instances to be able to get up to 50% reduction. You can, the reserved instances for AVS physical nodes save less than native Azure VMs, but that's just because of the size of the servers and the specs that are needed. You can also still leverage your hybrid benefits as well in security updates within AVS as well. So if you're still running older versions of OS or SQL environments, then you can still upgrade to the cloud version of AVS, and Microsoft will give you that extended 3-year benefit for those older operating systems to get them upgraded. Also, this is as important as well is that since this is a very important program to Microsoft, they offer certain funding programs to be able to help offset some of the professional services costs if you choose to use a partner to leverage. And within this example, Planet received a significant amount of money, close to $1 million to help another organization migrate their their existing on-premise VMware to AVS. So usually the programs start at $25,000 from a funding perspective, but depending on the size of your environment and the approval, there is dollars available to help offset that program if that is something you choose to look at. If you already have VMware licenses today, there are a couple of options that Microsoft offer, or if you've already gone through the renewal process, you can use AVS Credit Offer or a VMware Cloud Universal Credits to potentially save on that. And I only say potentially because that's something that Microsoft specifically owns, but it's worth talking to the Microsoft team to understand if how you fit or where that works in your world to better understand what that cost would look like. The ecosystem on VMware within AVS. So, here's so if you're going to leverage the Microsoft licensing of AVS as part of the all-in-one costs, the software that's included with that is the ESXi 7.0, which is really the vCenter's the cluster foundation and framework, the vSAN 7.0, the NESXT advanced. That's for existing. If you're deploying net new, 4.1.1 is now available as well. And then HCX 4.x Enterprise, which is really, this is the migration engine that supports the sync lift and shift, in addition to the vMotion from the ESXi tool sets. So if you'll notice, Horizon's not included as part of that licensing embed. So Site Recovery Manager is not included, the Tanzu, vRealize, the Load Balancer Enterprise, and a lot of that's because of some of those you can be replaced with native tools. So for instance, with Horizon, since that's kind of the standard virtual desktop that we see clients use with VMware, you could potentially leverage AVD to replace that without having to deploy Horizon in Azure to be able to support your virtual desktop components. So what does the VMware solution, what's the value that it provides, and how do you separate what you manage today on premise versus what does VMware look like in the cloud? And so what's really key here is if you notice, Microsoft, as part of that shared responsibility model that we all talk about from time to time, is you can see, Microsoft will start to own, from a management perspective, the hypervisor, the storage, the servers, the things that you do on a day-to-day basis. A lot of that responsibility gets shifted to Microsoft because it's all built in under the Azure VMware solution set. And what you own today is really the management, the applications, and the operating systems, as well as the networking itself, because that's going to be a key piece when we start talking about stretching a network or getting just deploying all up into AVS, because the networking in AVS is all virtual, and once the hybrid connection is made and the new network segments are automated with BGP. So NSXT network management is still required in AVS, but all the physical networking is managed by Microsoft from an operational perspective. So what are some of the benefits today of leveraging AVS? So AVS is fully integrated with the entirety of the Azure ecosystem. So, you can start to leverage Azure monitoring. You can start to leverage NetApp files from a storage perspective. And where NetApps, and there's a slide to this, and I'll just talk about it at a high level, you can leverage NetApps to be able to off-take some of the storage requirements out of the nodes themselves, which helps you pull, use the node itself for more compute, but separate the storage components outside of it. You can start integrating from the express route, a route server, all of the virtual networks and virtual gateways within Azure. You can begin to leverage the monitoring tools such as Sentinel, Azure Monitor, Cost Management, all of that from within that single pane of glass within Azure. A lot of from other migrations that we've done, Arc becomes a key component, because in some cases you may not migrate everything out, or you may be an expansion. So how do you leverage the same capabilities that you're getting from AVS back onto your on-premise? And this is where enabling Arc to be able to manage those operations really helps drive us that single pane of glass within Azure. You can start looking to also then replace some of your other third-party tools from a security perspective, such as Defender for Cloud, the Azure Firewall. And then now you can start to also leverage the backup and site recovery native services. It's not that you have to, but you can start to then depend on the Microsoft ecosystem for some of those additional costs or additional services that you may be using externally today. From a compliance coverage, this is a big one because of some of the work that we do and help customers today with an Azure government tenants. NIST 800, 171, and 853 aren't on the list, but they're supported on the platform. So, if you have portions of a workload that require a particular compliance standard, can you use AVS to establish support? In other words, can you achieve compliance in AVS only and not include my existing VMware? So it depends, but you can. Provided you plan for the authentication, the authorization, and network controls properly, you can isolate out environments that require certain compliance or security standards. Your data sovereignty is, of course, a part of that planning. But again, these are the things that you have to take into consideration as you start to think about what something or infrastructure in Azure looks like and how does it meet all of the check boxes from a complete solution. So we talked about the storage that was included with the SCDC and the AVS cluster. But again, and this is what I highlighted earlier, how does NetApps fit into your storage requirements? So NetApps provides a high-speed, low-latency storage option for those data stores. So this allows you for storage scaling independent of the clusters themselves to meet the needs of the storage-intensive applications. So you don't have to depend on just the AVS infrastructure today to be able to support the storage. You can really consume those. If you don't want to grow or pay the cost for a fourth node, you could look at leveraging NetApp files to be able to put more compute into those nodes and then really leverage NetApp files for that specific storage. Or you may have a very specific requirement from a speed of the application for some of those additional file workloads. You can use NetApp files as your AVS storage option, and it really helps reduce the total cost because storage intensive apps are less expensive to run using NetApp files versus leveraging the compute within AVS to store that. You have very flexible migration options with Azure VMware today. HCX migrations are synced so that you can set a schedule, a stage, and execute at a given moment in time. vMotion is an instant migration type. So you can just go into that environment. You can say, I'm going to put this server immediately within the AVS environment, but it's very close to real time as it gets. In a lot of our implementations, just so you don't impact stakeholders, we will leverage the HCX migration approach because you can sync them over time, which doesn't impact users' use of the application or database or files that are stored on those servers today. And you can schedule and stage that migration. An important difference between those is the HCX method leaves an image behind after the workload has been migrated. So it's considered a safer method, allowing for an instant reversal, or you can migrate it back over, or you can delete it once it was successful. So as you think about the different workloads and what you do have different options to be able to leverage the speed of how fast or how thoughtful you want to move servers from your existing VMware on-premise to an Azure VMware solution. So we talked about a lot of the good things. What are some of the considerations and the challenges when you start to leverage AVS? So network integrations, they're identified as a challenge, and why is that? Because a lot of times you're going to want to stretch your network from your on-premise data center into Azure. And stretch networking allows an existing network to be present in both the local data center and inside of AVS. And this is really what's going to support moving those workloads that can't change an IP for various reasons. So when you stretch the network, we create a dependency within the local data center network, and therefore, you can't move within that environment. If you're looking to exit a data center, this means that the stretched network has to be dissolved at some point in time. So the benefit from stretched networking is only adding more time to make embeddable changes to IPs at a later stage. One of our recommendations is to consider to re-IP all migration workloads so you don't need this dependency. But again, that's additional set of work. Another challenge that we've talked about is time and latency. You know, there is some latency in network connectivity. You build AVS in one Microsoft region, and depending on where you're located and where that Azure region is, it's not really next door like the on-premise that you have today. So you get really that physical distance that creates a minimum latency between the local data center and the AVS environment. And so while it doesn't seem like that could be a significant challenge, certain workloads can't sustain, high latency applications. So you want to think about what those high latency or those low latency requirement applications are, so you can make sure and plan the network dependencies in Azure for it, or you put those towards the last of that migration and figure out that strategy as it relates to the migration and client connectivity. That way, there's no surprises if you move something over and your users are experiencing a delay for whatever reason. You want to be able to account for it and plan for it accordingly. So the other consideration from an Azure perspective is DR capabilities. So for on-premise to AVS and AVS to AVS, you can use partner VMware disaster recovery tools such as VMware SRM, Zerto, or Jetstream to sync between VMware environments to provide those DR capabilities. But you could also leverage Azure Site Recovery for AVS to leverage Azure Native Services as your DR recovery options too. So again, you can bring your own tools, you can bring your own solutions, or leverage native. This isn't the entirety of having to always focus on leveraging Averager for everything. You have options and you can deploy what you're comfortable with as you need to make those decisions to be able to best meet your goals and objectives within the project. So 10 things to remember about AVS. So it's a Microsoft first-party Azure service, VMware Cloud certified. You have dedicated hardware in Azure running VMware. VMware partnership is a dedicated AVS support team within Microsoft. This is also considered the quickest migration path to leverage your existing VMware skills. You may have invested time over the last 8, 9, 10 years. You may have built out very specific capabilities within VMware, and you want to make sure you can continue using those in AVS. This is the best path to be able to support it. You do have to purchase a minimum of 3 nodes, and we'll kind of show where that reflects in the pricing. And you may have a question, well, how many servers or VMware nodes can a AVS node support? So, that question is usually it depends on the storage, but what we have seen is between, and this is a ballpark, between 150 to 200 nodes per 150 to 200, VMware nodes or servers per AVS node. That's kind of a broad range. But again, it all comes down to your storage needs for each of those environments. If you're looking to, not renew your licenses with VMware directly, VMware licenses are included in the Azure VMware Services hosting cost, which includes ESXi, vCenter, vSAN, NSX-T, and HCX. And then you also have the integration with the other Azure services as well to be able to support low latency. You have external storage options without adding more nodes. We talked about NetApps. And then from an, ER is recommended in most cases, ExpressRoute, but VPN is an option. And HCX migration through the internet is supported. From a pricing perspective, you have your reserved instances options and Azure hybrid benefits and free extended security updates for those other capabilities. So that's everything that's involved as you think about how to consider AVS as part of your replacement strategy in terms from a cost perspective and what's included and the value that it brings. So AVS pricing. So this is an Azure government in the VA region pricing. You know, the AV36 is what's available. It's, at a 3-year reserved pricing, it's $519 an hour. This is for a single node. So if you're going to run 3 nodes full time at a 3-year reserved instance, it's approximately $11K a month for that pricing. That's just doing the quick calculator to be able to support your deployment. That doesn't also consider, the associated costs for, if NetApp storage or the associated costs for networking and the Azure firewall or any of the other Azure native services. This is to spin up an AVS node in those within Azure. So we had talked about the additional other options that are available besides just AVS, if you're considering getting out of VMware from an on-premise. So why should you consider Azure Compute the native services? So really what you can do here is from a compute overview, you can spin up native VMs and migrate your nodes directly to native Azure VMs. You have VMs that are offered in a range of sizes and configurations and operating systems. You can leverage container instances to run containers without VMs. You could leverage Azure Kubernetes services within a full environment. You also have Azure Functions, Azure Batch. You can leverage AVD, Azure Cycle Cloud if you need HPC. So if you're looking to escape from VMware and Broadcom in its entirety, these are the other options. And so this migration is a little different from the AVS, right? Because you're taking things today and you're moving them into independent VMs within Azure. So it's a different migration strategy, leveraging a tool such as Azure Migrate. But again, now you're pricing and you're paying on a per VM need versus the AVS infrastructure and costs, and you can look at your ROI and cost savings a little bit differently from that perspective. VMs are offered in a range of sizes and configurations. Here's a sample architecture of what that would look like and how you separate out your disks from the VM itself, your logs and your storage accounts, and what that architecture would look like. You have your choice of disks from physical disks to premium. And then the other one is, there's some situations where you can actually get out of the business of running VMs itself and the required OS management and other components. So you can leverage Azure Platform Services really from a database perspective or from a container or a compute perspective. So if you have custom applications that you've built and you want to get out of the business of just managing that related infrastructure around it, you could look to potentially port your application and run in a container. And so behind the scenes, that's all built in. You can run it on a Windows container or a Linux container, but you're not really paying for the license of it itself or the upgrades or the management of that OS. It's just that serverless platform that allows you to deploy your application and run from within that environment. It encapsulates the application with dependencies and runtime environment, so you can have it across very different environments. So why use a container? From a portability, you can run applications consistently. You have scalability, so you can scale applications up or down based on demand. And efficiency, you can utilize those resources more efficiently by running multiple containers on a single host. So you can run more different applications in that single host without spinning up more containers as needed. Then you can isolate that application to improve security and reliability. So what are some of the standard use cases that we've seen to leverage containers? If you're looking to or have a microservices architecture, DevOps, continuous integration, hybrid multi-cloud deployments where you can deploy containers across on-premises and cloud environments for flexibility and agility. A common one that we have seen is taking SQL that may be on VMs today and migrating those to a PaaS environment. So if you have VMware today and you want to reduce the scope of your VMware, and they're supporting today a number of databases, a common approach in that project as you're migrating is to take your databases and migrate those to a SQL managed instance. So in this case, again, you're removing the need from an infrastructure and an OS management, and you're moving those databases to a single SQL environment within that AVS structure. And then it's just sitting it alone to be able to be managed and just use those database services. So you're getting rid of the OS management requirements and just focus on using SQL in itself. You can leverage many different types of data services and analytics platforms as well within that environment. So SQL DB, Cosmos, Azure Database for Postgre. Again, lots of flexibility, lots of options. It really comes down to what best fits, your existing environment and existing infrastructure to support that. So, a lot of times, you see some of the standard Microsoft designs, the big blocks and how things fit. It only takes into consideration, that service you're looking to deploy. What does a big picture Azure environment look like that also includes AVS, but also the deployment of native services as well? So really, we just want to share a kind of a thought example around if you were going to leverage Azure as part of a larger initiative, or you may be using some of these services today and you want to deploy AVS within it. What does an architecture look like to be able to support it? And so, our standard, and I think, probably for many customers, is you look at it from a hub spoke model to be able to deploy those services and then to be able to deploy those VNets and networking and connectivity between those environments. And then where does AVS fit within those other Azure native services that you may be using, and how is it managed overall? So this is an example of an approach of how you can look at, an existing data center approach and how you can leverage your compute, SQL managed instances, if you're going to leverage app services, maybe Azure Files to get rid of file servers, what your shared services environment looks like, and really where VMware or AVS plays that part into your overarching architecture, deployment, and governance within Azure itself. So you may be thinking you're ready to go. Where do you start? So one of our special offers that we have is there is a no charge option for qualified customers where we can assess your existing environment and kind of help you build out what that looks like from a cost perspective, nodes, or leveraging native services in Azure. So you can reach out to your Planet account executive or to the YouAlreadyOwnIt team to be able to learn more. But again, it's really important to note, and to leverage what funding and options may be available to you from a Microsoft perspective as well. And, as I referred to that other project, and, we received close to $1 million just to help support that funding of deployment and that migration for AVS. So Ken, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm sure it's been a quiet bunch here so far. One thing I just want to, before we get into questions, we have plenty of links here. Again, you'll get a link to the recording as well as the PowerPoint deck later. But you can, if you have questions later, feel free to send them to that YouAlreadyOwnIt link email address. But we would love to hear from you right now. Some feedback, some thoughts. We saw in the polls that 50% and 50%. So 50% said no, they're not ready to even think about this, and 50% said yes, or they're still evaluating. So from the people who said no, we would love to hear what are the things holding you back. Is it cost? Is it because you're just renewed your contract with Broadcom? We'd love to hear about that. And with that said, we did have one question concerning someone who said that they had just renewed their contract with Broadcom. And did we have any suggestions on what to do if they've just done that? Jason, any thoughts about that?
So yeah, so there's an option to, and that was highlighted. We can Microsoft has some options out there to be able to leverage some either credits
Yeah.
or VMware credits. That's not something, unfortunately, Planet can control, but we can. You may want to talk to your Microsoft account team, or we could help that conversation with your Microsoft team and to help support that as necessary as well. So there is an option for those customers that want to bring their own.
And Kevin, before we open up the questions, I am going to stop the recording. So if anyone
Thanks.
wants to come off of mute to ask their question, you can do so without worrying about it being recorded. So we're going to do that now.
Yeah, great point.